The new nanny signed to the Vampire King's mute son during her first day at the palace. The throne room fell deathly silent. What she didn't know, she was the first person in 5 years who'd spoken his language, and the grieving king who'd built walls around his heart would tear down his entire kingdom to keep her there. Hello friends, welcome to our story. Before we begin, please like this video and subscribe. Also, tell us in the comments where you're watching from, we'd love to know. The iron gates groaned like dying things. Lillian's breath came in short bursts as she followed the head steward through corridors that seemed to swallow light itself. 2 weeks since she'd been hired, and still the vampire palace felt like walking through someone else's nightmare. The stone walls pressed close, adorned with portraits of pale faces and sharp smiles. Keep your head down, her predecessor had warned before fleeing back to the human villages. Don't question. Don't interfere. Don't get attached. This way, Miss Thorne, the steward hissed, his voice thin and cold as winter wind. The king requires your formal presentation. Lillian's hands trembled as she smoothed her blue dress with its crisp white color. She'd seen King Lucien Valtoris only once, from a distance, crossing the palace courtyard like a storm-given flesh. Platinum hair cascading past his shoulders, dark robes that moved like smoke, and eyes that could pin you to the wall without touching. Today, he wore formal attire even for a simple introduction, as if daring the world to find him less than terrifying. But it wasn't the king that made her footsteps falter. It was the small boy sitting alone on a stone bench beside the throne. Prince Alvin couldn't have been older than 8. While courtiers in velvet and jewels filled the shadowed throne room, discussing estate taxes and territorial disputes, the child sat perfectly still. His burgundy suit was immaculate, buttoned to the throat, making him look like a miniature adult playing dress-up. Dark hair framed a pale face, and his hands clutched a carved wooden horse so tightly his knuckles had gone white. No one addressed him. No one even glanced his way. He might as well have been one of the marble statues lining the walls, beautiful, silent, utterly invisible. Lillian approached the center of the room, her footsteps echoing despite her attempts at silence. The steward gestured sharply for her to kneel before the throne. She obeyed, pressing her palm to the cold stone floor. "Your Majesty," the steward announced, his voice carrying through the vaulted ceiling. "The new governess for the prince's household. Miss Lillian Thorne of the Eastern Villages. Don't make eye contact with the king. Don't speak unless spoken to. Don't." A courtier in crimson swept past, his cape billowing. The edge caught the wooden horse in Prince Alvin's grip. Time fractured into slow motion. The carved toy tumbled from the child's hands, spinning through the air. It struck the marble floor with a sharp crack that echoed like breaking bone. One of the horse's delicate legs snapped clean off, skittering across the stone. The boy's mouth opened in a silent gasp, his whole body going rigid. His hands flew to his throat, then dropped helplessly to his sides. His eyes, dark and enormous in his small face, filled with something that looked like drowning. Not a single person moved to help him. The courtier who'd knocked the toy didn't even pause. Nobles continued their whispered conversations as if a child's heart wasn't shattering 3 feet away. The king remained on his throne, statuesque, his expression carved from ice. Prince Alvin's shoulders began to shake. Silent. Completely, utterly silent. Without thinking, Lillian's body moved before her mind could catch up. She crossed the protocol line, the invisible boundary between common staff and royalty, and knelt before the prince. Her hands lifted, fingers forming shapes she hadn't used since her mother's funeral. "It's okay," she signed, her movements fluid and gentle. "I'm here. You're safe." Prince Alvin's head snapped up so fast his neck should have hurt. His eyes locked onto hers, truly met them for the first time, and suddenly they were filled with something that looked like starlight breaking through a tomb. His small hands jerked up from his lap, trembling violently. "You can see me," he signed back, his movements sharp and desperate, almost wild with speed. "You understand? You can hear my hands." His fingers blurred together, forming words so quickly they tumbled over each other. A smile split his face, the kind of expression that looked like it had forgotten how to exist. Like sunlight on something that had been buried alive. "No one listens except teacher," Alvin continued, leaning forward so eagerly he nearly fell off the bench. "But teacher leaves when lessons end." "Are you real? What's your name? Can you stay? Please say you can stay." Silence. The word didn't shout. It didn't need to. King Lucien Valtoros's voice cut through the throne room like a blade sliding between ribs, quiet, precise, and absolutely lethal. Every conversation died mid-word. Every breath held. Even the candles seemed to stop flickering. Lillian felt the command wrap around her chest like iron bands. The king rose from his throne, unfolding to his full, impossible height. He was tall, inhumanly tall, with shoulders that blocked out the light streaming through the Gothic windows behind him. His platinum hair caught the candlelight like spun silver, and his dark robes moved around him as if alive. He wore no crown today, but he didn't need one. Authority radiated from him like cold from a winter grave. He wasn't looking at Lillian. He was looking at his son. Prince Alvin's hands froze mid-sign, the smile sliding off his face like melting wax. The light died in his eyes. His shoulders curled inward, his chin dropped to his chest, and his whole body seemed to fold in on itself, making him even smaller, even more invisible than before. The wooden horse and its broken leg lay forgotten at his feet. The king's gaze shifted to Lillian. She couldn't breathe, couldn't move. His eyes were the color of winter storms, pale gray shot through with silver, and just as merciless. "You," he said quietly, each word deliberate as a death sentence. "Stand." Lillian's legs barely held her weight as she rose. Around the throne room, nobles whispered behind gloved hands and jeweled fans. She caught fragments through the rushing in her ears. "Signed to the prince." Never seen him respond like that. Mere human governess. How dare she presume? King Lucien descended from the dais, each footstep measured and purposeful. The crowd parted before him like water before a ship's prow, courtiers pressing themselves against the walls to avoid his path. He stopped exactly 3 paces from Lillian, close enough that she could see the way his jaw clenched, the silver threading through his platinum hair at the temples, the faint scars across his knuckles that spoke of violence older than her grandmother. "Where did you learn that?" His voice was soft, but it carried through the silent hall like distant thunder before a storm. "At my village, your majesty." Lillian's voice cracked, her throat dry as bone. "My mother was, she couldn't hear. She taught me to speak with my hands before," her breath hitched. "Before she passed." The king's expression didn't change. Not a flicker of emotion crossed that perfect, terrible face. "Your mother," he repeated, each syllable sharp. "She's dead." 5 years ago, sire." Something moved behind the king's eyes, too quick to name, gone before Lillian could identify it. He glanced back at his son. Prince Alvin sat frozen on the bench, small hands clenched in his lap, watching them both with desperate, pleading eyes that begged for something no one seemed willing to give. The king's jaw worked as if chewing words too bitter to swallow. The throne room held its breath. Finally, King Lucien turned to the thin, severe-looking vampire standing near the throne, Lord Draven, the royal chancellor, with his hawk-like features and eyes like frozen amber. "Find Miss Thorne's contract," the king said, his voice still that terrible, quiet command. "Reassign her duties. Effective immediately." Lillian's heart plummeted. Dismissed. On her first formal day. She'd be blacklisted, would never work in service again. "She will serve as Prince Alvin's personal governess," the king continued, and the world tilted sideways. Private chambers in the East Wing, adjacent to the prince's quarters. Full access to his daily schedule. "Report directly to me." The whispers exploded into barely contained gasps. Lord Draven's expression curdled. "Your Majesty, surely such an unvetted appointment. Are you questioning my judgment, Draven?" The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. "No, Your Majesty." The Chancellor's bow was stiff, fury radiating from every line of his thin body. "Of course not." King Lucian looked at Lillian one last time. His eyes were still cold, still distant, but something in them had shifted, something that might have been desperation, if kings were capable of such things. "You will begin tomorrow at dawn," he said. Then, almost too quietly for her to hear, "Don't make me regret this." He turned and left through a side door, his robes billowing behind him like smoke, leaving chaos and whispered outrage in his wake. Lillian stood frozen, her heart hammering so hard she thought her ribs might crack. Slowly, she turned to look at Prince Alvin. The boy was staring at her with those huge dark eyes, his hands hovering uncertainly in the air. Then, so small she almost missed it, he signed one word. "Tomorrow." Lillian's throat tightened. She nodded. The smile that broke across Prince Alvin's face could have lit the entire dark palace from within. That night, lying in the narrow bed of her new chambers, so close to the prince's rooms she could hear the old stones settling, Lillian stared at the ceiling and wondered what she'd walked into. Down the hall, in a study lined with books no one read anymore, King Lucian Valtoris sat in the dark and watched his own hands try and fail to form the shapes he'd seen his son make. The shapes that had made his son smile for the first time since Evangeline died. His fingers felt clumsy. Foreign. Wrong. He let his hands fall to his desk, defeated. Tomorrow, he told himself. He'd deal with this tomorrow. Meanwhile, 3 doors away, Prince Alvin clutched his broken wooden horse to his chest and dared to hope that maybe, just maybe, tomorrow wouldn't hurt quite as much as every day before. Dawn broke over the palace like a bruise, purple and gray, reluctant light creeping through windows that seemed designed to keep it out. Lillian stood outside Prince Alvin's door, her hand hovering over the brass handle, heart drumming against her ribs. The East Wing corridor stretched behind her, empty and cold, lined with portraits of stern-faced vampires whose painted eyes seemed to follow her every movement. She knocked. 3 soft raps that echoed too loudly in the silence. No answer came, but she hadn't expected one. Taking a breath that did nothing to steady her nerves, she turned the handle and stepped inside. The prince's quarters were larger than her entire childhood home, high ceilings, tall windows draped in burgundy velvet, furniture that looked carved from a single piece of dark wood. Everything was immaculate, perfectly arranged. The bed made with military precision, books stacked in exact right angles on the desk, not a speck of dust anywhere. It looked like a room prepared for inspection, not one where a child lived. Except for the drawings. They covered every available surface. Pinned to the walls, spread across the desk, tucked into the edges of the mirror frame. Hundreds of them, rendered in charcoal and ink with surprising skill for such young hands. And every single one depicted the same woman, dark hair cascading past her shoulders, kind eyes, a smile that seemed to radiate warmth even through pencil strokes. She danced in some drawings, read books in others, held a baby in her arms. In one, she stood in a garden, her hand outstretched as if inviting someone to join her. Lillian's throat tightened. Lady Evangeline. The human queen who died 5 years ago, leaving behind a widowed king and a son who'd lost his voice along with his mother. "Good morning," she signed, knowing Alvin was awake even though she couldn't see him yet. A small head poked out from behind the heavy curtains by the window. Prince Alvin's dark hair stuck up at odd angles, his nightshirt wrinkled, and his eyes were cautious, as if he half expected yesterday to have been a dream. When he saw her hands moving, something like relief washed over his features. He emerged fully, padding across the carpet on bare feet, and signed back, "You came. You're real. I thought maybe I imagined you." "I'm very real," Lillian assured him, settling into a chair near the window. "And I'm not going anywhere." Alvin's hands hesitated, then moved slowly. "People always say that. Then they leave." Before Lillian could respond, The boy crossed to a large trunk beneath his bed. He dragged it out with effort, the wood scraping against the floor, and lifted the lid. Her breath caught. Inside were hundreds of carved wooden animals. Bears and wolves, birds and horses, rabbits and deer. Each one roughly the size of her palm, whittled with varying degrees of skill, the oldest crude and blocky, the newest remarkably detailed. They filled the trunk to the brim, a menagerie of loneliness made tangible. Alvin's hands moved, his signs small and careful. One for each day. Since mother died. Since father stopped looking at me. He picked up a wolf, tracing its carved fur. Teacher comes twice a week for lessons. The rest of the time, it's just me and them. They don't leave. Lillian felt something crack open in her chest. She knelt beside him, meeting his eyes at his level. How many are there? His fingers moved mechanically, as if he'd counted too many times. 1,843. 5 years. 1,843 days of being invisible in his own home. May I see your favorites? She asked gently. For the next hour, Alvin showed her his collection. He'd organized them by type, by size, by the order he'd carved them. He signed stories about each one. This rabbit was from the day it rained for a week straight. This bear from the first time he'd carved something he was proud of. This bird from a morning when he'd watched sparrows outside his window and wanted to fly away with them. Lillian listened, really listened, asking questions that made his signs grow more animated. And then she taught him something his tutor never had: signs for emotions beyond the basic ones. The sign for silly, which involved wiggling fingers near your nose. The sign for mischief, which looked like you were twirling an invisible mustache. The sign for tickle, which she demonstrated by wiggling her fingers toward him. His eyes widened. His hands copied the movements, testing them out, and then he signed. Teacher never showed me these. She says I need to learn proper signs. For a prince. Well, Lillian signed back. Even princes deserve to be silly sometimes. She made the sign again, exaggerating it comically, crossing her eyes. The sound that came from Prince Alvin wasn't quite a laugh. It had no voice behind it, but his shoulders shook, his mouth opened in a silent giggle, and his whole face transformed with pure, uncomplicated joy. He clapped his hands over his mouth as if shocked by his own reaction, then signed frantically, "Do it again." "Please." Lillian obliged, adding even more ridiculous expressions, and watched as this lonely child dissolved into the kind of laughter that came from somewhere deep and long suppressed. His hands moved in excited, scattered signs, half-formed words that didn't quite make sense, the visual equivalent of breathless giggles. Neither of them noticed the figure standing motionless in the doorway. King Lucien Baltoris had come to check on the new governess, to ensure she understood her duties and boundaries. But he'd frozen at the threshold, transfixed by a sound he'd forgotten existed. Not a sound, exactly. But his son's joy, silent yet deafening, filling the room like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. Alvin's head thrown back, his small body shaking with laughter, his hands moving so fast they blurred. And that human woman, sitting on the floor like a common playmate, making absurd faces and signing things that made his son happy. Lucien's chest constricted painfully. When was the last time he'd made Alvin smile like that? Had he ever? He left before either of them could see him, his footsteps silent on the corridor stones, something he couldn't name burning behind his eyes. In the servants' quarters below, gossip spread like wildfire over morning bread. Did you hear? The human governess spent 2 hours alone with the prince. Unseemly, if you ask me. She's overstepping already. I heard she thinks she can fix him. As if there's anything to fix. Poor boy's broken beyond mending. Mark my words, she won't last a month. They never do. And in his study lined with ancient texts and territorial maps, Lord Chancellor Draven steepled his fingers, his amber eyes calculating. He summoned a pale servant with a gesture. "Inform Miss Thorne I require her presence this afternoon," he said softly. I believe we need to discuss the boundaries of her new position. His smile was thin and cold as a blade. After all, he continued, more to himself than the servant, nannies have such short careers here. It would be tragic if she forgot her place. The servant bowed and departed, leaving Draven alone with his schemes. Above, in a child's room filled with drawings of a dead mother and an army of carved companions, Lillian taught Prince Alvin the sign for friend. He practiced it over and over, as if afraid he'd forget, as if the word itself might disappear if he didn't hold onto it tightly enough. Outside the window, storm clouds gathered on the horizon, dark and promising rain. The formal dining hall stretched like a cathedral of shadows and gold. Chandeliers dripping with crystals cast fractured light across the long table where 24 vampire nobles sat in their finest evening attire. Lillian stood against the wall with the other attendants, hands clasped, watching a ritual that felt more like theater than a meal. Prince Alvin sat 3 seats from his father's right hand, small and rigid in a burgundy jacket buttoned to his throat. A plate of untouched food sat before him, roasted pheasant, glazed vegetables arranged like art. He held his fork with perfect etiquette, occasionally moving food around his plate in a pantomime of eating, but nothing actually reached his mouth. King Lucian presided at the head of the table, magnificent and terrible in black formal wear, his platinum hair pulled back with a silver clasp. He spoke with Lord Victor about border disputes, discussed trade routes with Lady Morgana, laughed coldly at some jest from the council members. His voice carried authority, his gestures commanded attention. But not once, not a single time, did he look at his son. Lillian watched with growing disbelief as the king's eyes swept the table, pausing on every face except one. When his gaze approached Alvin's section, it would skip over the boy entirely, as if there were a blank space where the prince sat. Alvin noticed. Of course he noticed. His shoulders drew inward with each oversight, his head dropping lower, until he seemed to be trying to disappear into his own color. When a servant reached across to refill Alvin's untouched wine glass, the boy flinched so violently his fork clattered against his plate. The sound echoed through a momentary lull in conversation. Several nobles glanced over with barely concealed disdain. The king's jaw tightened, but he turned deliberately to Lord Draven and continued discussing grain yields as if nothing had happened. Alvin's hands moved in his lap, small, desperate signs that no one was watching. Sorry. I'm sorry. Something hot and furious ignited in Lillian's chest. The dinner dragged on for another excruciating hour. When it finally ended and the nobles dispersed like well-dressed vultures, Lillian watched the king stride toward his private study, his cape billowing behind him. She glanced at Alvin being escorted back to his quarters by a stone-faced servant, the boy's shoulders hunched in defeat. She made a decision that would either save her position or destroy it. Lillian crossed the palace corridors with purpose, her footsteps echoing off marble floors. She didn't let herself think, didn't let doubt slow her stride. The guards outside the king's study moved to stop her, but she spoke before they could. Tell His Majesty that Miss Thorne requests an audience. It's regarding Prince Alvin. One guard disappeared inside. Returned moments later, expression carefully blank. The king will see you. Briefly. The study was all dark wood and leather, shelves of books rising to a ceiling painted with constellations. A fire burned in the hearth despite the spring warmth, as if the king needed flames to combat some inner cold. Lucian stood by the window, a glass of dark liquid in his hand, his back to her. You have 2 minutes, Miss Thorne. His voice was flat, dismissive. Why won't you look at him? The words escaped before Lillian could soften them. The king's shoulders stiffened. He didn't turn around. I beg your pardon? Your son. At dinner. You looked at everyone except him. You spoke to everyone except him. He sat 3 seats away, and you acted as if he didn't exist. You overstep. The temperature in the room plummeted. Drastically. He's a child. Your child. And he's You have been in this palace for 3 days. Lucien turned now, and his eyes were no longer human. They'd gone silver pale, catching the firelight like a predator's. 3 days, and you presume to lecture me on matters you cannot possibly understand. Lillian's survival instincts screamed at her to back down, to apologize, to run. She stayed rooted. Then help me understand. Because what I see is a boy who's desperate for his father's attention, and a father who can't. The word cracked like a whip. Lucien moved within human speed, suddenly close enough that she could feel the cold radiating from him. You think this is about can't? His voice dropped to something raw and jagged. He has her eyes. Did you know that? Exactly her eyes, that same dark brown with gold flecks when the light hits them just right. And every time I look at him, every time I see those eyes, I'm back in that room 5 years ago. Watching her bleed. Listening to her beg me to save her. And I couldn't. The glass in his hand shattered. Blood, red, startlingly human, dripped from his palm, but he didn't seem to notice. I am the Vampire King. I've conquered kingdoms, defeated armies, survived centuries. But I couldn't save my wife from childbirth complications. Couldn't save the one person who made me feel like something more than a monster. His voice turned hollow. He lived. She died. And I am reminded of that failure every time I see his face. Lillian's fury dimmed, replaced by something deeper. So you save yourself by pretending he doesn't exist? Lucien's mask cracked. I protect him. From wars, from political threats, from yourself? Lillian took a step closer, reckless now. You're so busy protecting him from danger that you've forgotten he's dying anyway. Just slower. Lonelier. The king's eyes flashed red, true crimson, the color of fresh blood, his vampire nature surging to the surface. His voice came out as a growl that held centuries of violence. Get out. Lillian held his gaze for one more heartbeat, then turned toward the door. Her hand on the handle, she paused. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper, but it cut through the room like a blade. He's counting. Every day you don't see him. Every day you pretend he's not there. He carves a wooden animal for each one. There are 1,843 of them in a trunk under his bed. She left, closing the door softly behind her. The study fell silent except for the crackling fire. King Lucien stood frozen, blood still dripping from his clenched fist onto the expensive carpet. 1,843. 5 years of days. 5 years of a child marking time in carved wood because his father couldn't bear to look at him. The glass slipped from his hand, shattering on the floor. He sank into his chair, and for the first time since Evangeline's death, King Lucien Baltoris buried his face in his bloodied hands and let the weight of what he'd done, what he'd failed to do, crash over him like a wave. In the corner, the fire burned lower, casting shadows that looked like ghosts. Down the corridor, Lillian pressed her back against the cold stone wall, her whole body shaking with adrenaline and terror at what she'd just done. She'd confronted a vampire king, challenged him, insulted him. She'd probably be dismissed by morning. But in his quarters, Prince Alvin sat at his window, staring at the stars and wondering why his father had looked so sad at dinner, even while refusing to look at him at all. He picked up a piece of wood and his carving knife, beginning work on animal number 1,844. A small bird this time. One that might someday learn to fly. The palace garden sprawled behind the east wing like something from a forgotten fairy tale, overgrown rose bushes tangled with night-blooming jasmine, stone paths cracked by tree roots, fountains silent and dry. Lillian pushed open the iron gate, its hinges screaming in protest, and watched Prince Alvin's eyes widen at the threshold. "When was the last time you were outside?" she signed. His small hands moved slowly. "Winter. Maybe before. I don't remember." "Then we're long overdue." Lillian extended her hand, and after a moment's hesitation, Alvin took it. The morning sun felt like a revelation. Alvin tilted his face toward it, eyes closed, soaking in warmth he'd been denied. His fingers trailed along hedges as they walked, testing textures: rough bark, velvet petals, cool stone. When they reached a section where wildflowers had broken through the manicured beds, he knelt and touched them with the reverence people usually reserved for sacred things. They settled on a bench beneath a willow tree, its drooping branches creating a curtain of green around them. Alvin picked a dandelion, turning it in his fingers, and his signs came slower now, weighted with something heavy. Teacher says mother loved gardens. That she planted most of these flowers herself. He paused, then added, Father says I look like her. That I have her eyes. His small hands trembled. Is that why he's sad? Because I remind him she's gone. Lillian's heart cracked clean through. She took his hands gently, making him look at her. Your father is sad because he lost someone he loved very much. That's not your fault. Love doesn't work that way. But if I wasn't born... Stop. She signed it firmly. You are not the reason your mother died. You are the reason she lived the way she did, with joy, with purpose, with love. You are her gift, not her ending. Alvin's eyes filled with tears he couldn't shed sounds for. He leaned into Lillian's shoulder, and she held him while his small body shook with silent sobs. Neither of them noticed the figure watching from a second-story window, or the servant who quietly withdrew into the shadows, making notes. In the council chamber, Lord Chancellor Draven stood before a semicircle of vampire nobles, his amber eyes gleaming with calculated concern. King Lucien sat at the head of the table, his expression carved from ice, still wearing the evidence of last night's conversation in the dark circles beneath his eyes. I bring troubling news regarding the prince's education, Draven began, his voice smooth as poison. The new governess, while well-intentioned, lacks the proper training for a child with such particular needs. In 1 week, she's done nothing but coddle the boy with games and outdoor excursions. The prince has smiled more in the past week than in the past year, Victor interjected from his seat. The king's younger brother was handsome in that effortless way vampires often were: dark hair, easy smile, eyes that crinkled with what seemed like genuine warmth. Perhaps coddling was precisely what he needed. With respect, Lord Victor, sentiment doesn't prepare a prince to rule. Draven's tone sharpened. The boy cannot speak, cannot address councils, cannot negotiate treaties. We must be realistic about his limitations. He's 8 years old, Lucien said quietly, dangerously. Indeed, Your Majesty. And in 8 years, what progress has been made? I propose we consult with the monastery of St. Cornelius. They have facilities designed for children who require specialized care, long-term care. The room fell silent. Everyone understood what Draven was suggesting. The monastery was where noble families sent their inconvenient problems to disappear. Victor leaned forward, his casual demeanor evaporating. You want to exile the crown prince because he communicates differently? That's what you're proposing. I'm proposing we acknowledge reality. Enough. Lucien's voice cut like a blade. This council is dismissed. The nobles filed out, but Draven's satisfied smile lingered in Lillian's mind when she heard about the meeting later from a sympathetic kitchen servant. The accident happened that afternoon. Alvin was sketching near the fountain when Lillian heard the grinding of stone against stone. She looked up to see a marble statue, a robed woman holding an urn, tilting on its pedestal. Tilting toward where Alvin sat, 15 feet of carved rock about to crush a child who couldn't hear it coming. Lillian moved on pure instinct. She grabbed Alvin's collar and yanked him backward just as the statue crashed down, exploding across the path where he'd been sitting moments before. Marble shards scattered like shrapnel. Alvin's eyes were huge with shock, his hands frozen mid-sketch. Lillian's heart hammered so hard she thought it might break her ribs. She scanned the garden, but saw no one. Yet the statue had been standing for centuries. What were the odds it would fall now, precisely when the prince sat beneath it? Come on, she signed shakily. Let's go inside. She was summoned to Draven's office within the hour. The chancellor's chambers were cold and austere, all sharp angles and dark wood, with windows that let in light but no warmth. Draven sat behind his desk like a judge presiding over an execution, his fingers steepled. Miss Thorne, I understand there was an incident in the gardens. A statue nearly killed the prince, my lord. How fortunate you were there to prevent tragedy. His tone suggested it was anything but fortunate. Though one wonders what possessed you to take the prince outside in the first place. The gardens are poorly maintained, full of hazards. Most governesses understand the importance of keeping their charges safe. Lillian kept her voice steady. The prince needs fresh air and exercise, my lord. The prince needs someone who understands boundaries. Draven rose, circling his desk like a predator. You've been here 1 week, and already you've made enemies. You challenge protocols, question authorities, fill the boy's head with false hope about his place in this world. His place is as the crown prince. His place is wherever the king decides it should be. Draven stopped close enough that Lillian could see the ancient coldness in his eyes. Continue on your current path, Miss Thorne, and you'll find yourself dismissed. Or worse. Accidents happen in palaces. Statues fall. Fires start. People disappear. The threat hung in the air, unmistakable. Lillian met his gaze without flinching. Is that all, my lord? Something flickered across Draven's face, surprise, perhaps, or grudging respect. You're either very brave or very foolish. I'm neither. I'm just someone who refuses to pretend a child doesn't matter. She left before he could respond, her hands shaking only after she'd cleared his corridor. That night, Lillian sat on Alvin's bed, signing him a story about a brave prince who learned that silence could be its own kind of strength. Alvin's eyes grew heavy, his breathing evening out, the carved bird he'd been working on still clutched in one small hand. She didn't notice the shadow in the doorway until she finished the story. King Lucian stood just outside the room, barely visible in the dim corridor light. Their eyes met across the space. He didn't enter, didn't speak. But he didn't leave either. He stayed there, watching his son sleep, one hand braced against the doorframe as if it was the only thing holding him upright. Lillian slowly stood and slipped past him, careful not to break whatever fragile thing was forming in the silence. As she walked down the corridor, she heard it, the softest sound, barely audible. The king, whispering to his sleeping son, "Forgive me. God help me, forgive me." In his bed, Alvin stirred, his hand opening to release the carved bird. It rolled across the covers, a small wooden creature with wings spread wide, ready to fly. The morning light caught dust motes in Alvin's room, turning them into tiny stars. Lillian sat cross-legged on the floor, papers spread around her like fallen leaves, while Alvin practiced his letters. His small hand gripped the pencil with fierce concentration, forming words with the same precision he used when carving his wooden animals. He set down the pencil and signed, his movements tentative. "Can you teach me to write the way we talk? With our hands." Lillian blinked. "You want to learn written language for sign language? Teacher only shows me signs for things I need. Good morning." "Yes, please." "Thank you." His hands moved faster now, excited. "But I want to write about the birds in the garden. About mother's flowers. He hesitated. About things that matter." Something shifted in Lillian's chest. "Then that's exactly what we'll do." Over the next 2 weeks, she discovered what the tutors and council members had failed to see. Prince Alvin was brilliant. He absorbed vocabulary like parched earth soaking up rain, connecting written words to signs with intuitive leaps that left her breathless. Within days, he was writing full sentences. Within a week, he was composing paragraphs describing the palace gardens, the way sunlight moved through his window, the dreams he couldn't speak aloud. Lillian documented everything, pages of his writing, notes about his progress, observations about his sharp mind and hungry curiosity. She kept them hidden in her quarters, insurance against those who called him unteachable. She was reviewing these papers one evening when a knock came at her door. Soft. uncertain. Not the sharp rap of servants or the demanding pound of nobles. King Lucian stood in the corridor, still dressed in his formal council attire, looking profoundly uncomfortable. He wouldn't meet her eyes. "Your Majesty." Lillian curtsied, her heart hammering. "Is something wrong?" "Is Alvin?" "The prince is fine." His voice was rough, as if the words cost him. I need to speak with you. May I enter?" She stepped aside, and the king filled her small chambers with his presence, too large, too powerful, like trying to contain a storm in a teacup. He moved to the window, his back to her, shoulders rigid. "Teach me," he said finally. "One sign. Just one." "Your Majesty?" "Son." The word came out broken. "Teach me how to sign son." Lillian's breath caught. She moved to stand beside him, close enough to demonstrate, but respecting the distance he needed. Her hands formed the sign slowly, a gesture that combined protection and belonging, one hand cradling the other. "Like this," she said softly. "It means my son." Both words together. Lucian raised his hands. They were large, scarred from centuries of warfare, trembling slightly as he tried to copy her movements. His fingers tangled, the gesture coming out clumsy and wrong. Frustration flashed across his face. "No, not quite." "May I?" When he nodded, Lillian gently adjusted his hands, guiding them into the proper shape. His skin was cold beneath her touch, but not unpleasantly so. "There. That's it." He practiced it 3 times, each attempt marginally better than the last. On the 4th try, he got it right, imperfect but recognizable, weighted with meaning that transcended technique. Again, his voice was barely audible. "As many times as you need." They stood there in the fading light, king and governess, while Lucian practiced signing a word he'd been unable to say for 5 years. Each repetition seemed to crack something open in him, his movements growing less mechanical and more genuine. Neither of them heard the small footsteps in the corridor. "Father." Alvin stood in the doorway, still in his nightshirt, his carved bird clutched in one hand. His eyes were huge, disbelieving, fixed on his father's hands still frozen in the sign they'd been practicing. The tableau held for one eternal heartbeat, father caught mid-gesture, son afraid to hope, governess holding her breath. Then Lucian's hands completed the movement, deliberate and clear. "My son." Alvin's face transformed. His hands flew up, signing so fast the words blurred together. "You're learning? You're learning my language? For me?" Yes." Lucian's voice cracked. He lowered himself slowly to one knee, bringing himself to Alvin's height for the first time in years. His hands moved again, painstakingly careful. "My son." The sign was rough, unpracticed, but it might as well have been poetry. Alvin's composure shattered. He dropped the carved bird and ran, 3 steps that closed a distance of 5 years, and crashed into his father's chest. His small arms wrapped around Lucian's neck, his face buried in his father's shoulder, his body shaking with silent sobs. Lucian's arms came up slowly, as if he'd forgotten how to hold his child. Then muscle memory overcame paralysis, and he pulled Alvin close, one large hand cradling the back of the boy's head. His eyes squeezed shut, and tears, impossible, devastating tears, tracked down his face. "I'm sorry," he whispered into Alvin's dark hair. "I'm so sorry. I was afraid. So afraid of losing you the way I lost her that I..." His voice broke. "I lost you anyway. By my own doing." Alvin pulled back just enough to sign, his hands clumsy with emotion. "You're here now. That's what matters. You're here." Lucian nodded, unable to speak. He signed again, "My son," and this time it came easier, like a language his body had been waiting to remember. They stayed like that, father and son, holding each other in the dim corridor while Lillian quietly wiped her own tears and tried to make herself invisible against the wall. She didn't see the shadow detach itself from the darker shadows further down the hall. But if she had, she would have recognized Lord Chancellor Draven's thin silhouette, the rigid way he held himself, the fury radiating from every line of his body. The Chancellor had built his political strategy on the prince's isolation, had counted on the king's grief keeping father and son separated, had planned for years to replace Alvin with Victor, to reshape the kingdom's future to his own design. And this human woman, this insignificant governess, was dismantling everything with her damned compassion and her impossible hope. Draven's hands clenched into fists. His amber eyes glowed in the darkness, cold and calculating. If the king was learning to communicate with his son, if they were building a bond that might prove unbreakable, then more drastic measures would be required. He melted back into the shadows, already planning. In the corridor, Alvin signed one more thing to his father, his small hands precise despite the tears still tracking down his cheeks. "Will you stay?" "Just until I fall asleep." Lucien looked at Lillian. She nodded once, understanding, and slipped away to her own chambers. Father and son walked together down the hall, Alvin's small hand swallowed by his father's larger one. For the first time in 1,844 days, Prince Alvin wouldn't fall asleep alone. And somewhere in the palace's stone heart, something that had been frozen for 5 years began, finally, to thaw. The breakfast tray arrived as it always did, silver dome gleaming, the aroma of honey cakes and spiced tea wafting through Alvin's chambers. Lillian lifted the cover while Alvin sat at his desk, absorbed in a drawing of his father. The scene was tender, 2 figures with hands raised, signing to each other beneath a willow tree. Something made Lillian pause. The honey cakes looked perfect, golden brown, studded with almonds, but there was a faint bitterness beneath the sweet smell. Almost imperceptible. Her mother's voice echoed from childhood, *trust your instincts. They're trying to keep you alive, *. She broke off a small piece of cake and tasted it. The world tilted sideways 3 seconds later. Her vision blurred, her stomach convulsed, and she collapsed to her knees. The silver tray clattered to the floor, porcelain shattering like bones. Alvin spun around, his mouth opening in a silent scream. He ran to her, his small hands grabbing her shoulders as she retched violently, her body trying to expel the poison. The room spun in sickening circles. The door burst open. Palace guards, then servants, then. King Lucien appeared like an avenging storm, his eyes blazing crimson, his carefully maintained humanity evaporating in the face of his son's terror and his governess's collapse. He dropped beside Lillian, one hand supporting her while the other gestured sharply. "Get the physician. Now. And bring me that tray, every piece of it." His voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It carried the weight of centuries and the promise of violence. Lillian was vaguely aware of being lifted, carried. The king's arms were cold but steady. Alvin's terrified face swam in and out of focus beside her, his hands signing frantically, words she couldn't quite track. The palace physician, an ancient vampire named Soren with gentle hands and sharp eyes, purged the poison from her system. It took 3 agonizing hours. When Lillian finally surfaced from the haze of pain and nausea, she found herself in the infirmary, weak as a newborn but alive. And beside her bed, holding her hand with desperate care, sat Prince Alvin. His eyes were red-rimmed from crying, his hair disheveled. When he saw her wake, relief crashed across his face. His hands moved immediately. "You're okay. You're okay. I thought, when you fell, I thought you'd leave like Mother did." "I'm not going anywhere," Lillian croaked, her throat raw. Over the next 2 days, Alvin barely left her side. He brought her drawings, portraits of her teaching him signs, images of them in the garden, sketches of the 3 of them together like a family. He sat in the chair beside her bed, working on his wooden carvings, as if his presence alone could keep death from returning. Meanwhile, King Lucien's fury shook the palace foundations. He ordered a full investigation, interrogated servants personally, his vampire nature on full display. Guards who'd been on duty that morning vanished into the dungeons. The kitchen staff underwent brutal questioning. But Lord Chancellor Draven supervised the investigation with meticulous care, and somehow, every lead evaporated. The poison was common hemlock, available in any garden. The servants who'd prepared the meal had unimpeachable alibis. The tray had passed through too many hands to trace its origin. A tragic accident, Draven concluded in his report. Perhaps contamination from the herb garden. We've dismissed the head cook as a precaution. Lucien's eyes promised murder, but without evidence, even a king's hands were tied. On the third day, Lillian woke to find Alvin asleep in the chair beside her bed, his head pillowed on his arms. A new carving sat on her bedside table, a woman with her hands raised in sign language, protective and fierce. She reached out and touched his hair gently. He stirred, blinking awake, and immediately his hands moved. "You're better. Much better. Thanks to you staying here, keeping me company." Alvin's face did something complicated, joy and sorrow tangled together. His hands hesitated, then signed slowly. "I was so scared. First Mother. Then I thought you'd." He couldn't finish the sign. "I'm right here," Lillian assured him, squeezing his hand. And then, so softly she almost missed it, a sound emerged from the boy who hadn't spoken in 5 years. "Thank you." 2 words, barely a whisper, rough from disuse. But unmistakably words. Lillian's breath stopped. Alvin's eyes went wide, his hand flying to his throat as if shocked by his own voice. They stared at each other in the dawn light filtering through the infirmary windows. "Alvin," Lillian said carefully, "can you speak? Have you always been able to?" His hands moved frantically. "Sometimes. Words get stuck. They hurt coming out. After Mother died, they stopped coming at all. Until just now. I didn't mean, I'm sorry. Don't apologize. Never apologize for your voice, however it sounds, whenever it comes." She sat up despite the dizziness. "This is selective mutism. It's trauma, not inability. Do you understand? You're not broken." Alvin's face crumpled. He nodded, then shook his head, then signed with trembling hands. "Does this make it worse? That I can speak but don't?" "No, sweetheart. It makes you human." But in the corridor outside, a servant who'd been listening pressed herself against the wall, then hurried away with information worth its weight in gold. The emergency council meeting was called for that evening. Lillian, still weak but furious, was barred from attending. She watched from Alvin's window as nobles streamed into the council chambers, their faces grave. Inside, Lord Draven stood before the assembled court, his expression perfectly calibrated between concern and righteous indignation. "Your Majesty, nobles of the court, I have received disturbing information regarding Prince Alvin." He paused, letting tension build. "The prince is not, in fact, mute. He can speak. He has chosen not to." Gasps rippled through the chamber. Lucien's face remained carved from ice, but his eyes burned. A servant overheard him speaking to the governess. 2 clear words. "Which means the prince has been deceiving us for years. Manipulating our sympathy. Refusing his duties not from inability, but from defiance." "That's absurd," Victor interjected. "He's a child who suffered trauma. He's the crown prince," Draven snapped. "In 6 weeks, the blood moon ceremony will determine his fitness to rule. How can we crown an heir who's spent years lying to his own court? Who refuses to speak not because he can't, but because he won't?" The murmurs grew louder. Lucien watched them turn, watched doubt spread like poison, the same poison that had nearly killed Lillian. "I move for formal evaluation," Draven continued, "by an independent council of physicians and scholars before the ceremony. If the prince is capable of speech and chooses silence, he chooses to abdicate his responsibilities. And we must choose an heir who will not." All eyes turned to the king. Lucien stood slowly, his presence filling the chamber. This was the moment. Defend his son publicly, admit that his heir was traumatized and struggling, show vulnerability in a court of predators. Or stay silent and lose Alvin to their machinations. My son, Lucien said, his voice carrying to every corner, will be evaluated. But not by this council's vultures. His eyes locked on Draven. By me. By his governess. By those who actually see him as more than a political inconvenience. Your Majesty. The blood moon ceremony will proceed as planned. Prince Alvin will present himself as heir. And anyone who moves against him between now and then, his eyes flashed crimson, will answer to me personally. This council is dismissed. Draven smiled thinly as the nobles filed out, because they both knew the real battle had just begun. Lucien appeared at Lillian's door the morning after the council meeting, his formal robes replaced by simple black clothing, his platinum hair loose around his shoulders. He looked less like a king and more like a man standing at the edge of an abyss, trying to decide whether to jump. Teach me, he said without preamble. Everything. I have 6 weeks before the blood moon ceremony. His jaw tightened. I've spent 5 years unable to speak to my son. I won't waste another day. Lillian studied him, the dark circles under his eyes, the rigid set of his shoulders, the desperate determination in his expression. It won't be easy. Sign language isn't just hand movements. It's expression, context, nuance. I've mastered 6 spoken languages and 3 dead ones. I can learn this. Can you be patient with yourself when you fail? The question landed like a blow. Lucien's mouth tightened, but he nodded once. Teach me. They began that afternoon in the library, away from prying eyes. Lillian started with basics, the alphabet, common phrases, the building blocks of communication. Lucien absorbed information like he was preparing for war, practicing each sign with methodical precision until his hands cramped. But precision wasn't the same as fluency. No, Lillian corrected gently when he signed "Good morning" with the stiffness of a military salute. It's not a command. It's a greeting. Soften your movements. Like this. She demonstrated, and Lucien tried again. Then again. His frustration built with each imperfect attempt, centuries of control warring against the vulnerability required to learn something new. Your Majesty, you're approaching this like a battle to be won. Sign language is a conversation. It requires. I know what it requires. His voice was sharp. Then he stopped, closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, something had shifted. I'm sorry. Show me again. By the end of the first week, Lucien could sign basic sentences. By the second, he could hold simple conversations. But the real transformation came when Alvin joined their lessons. The prince entered the library hesitantly, unsure of his place in this new dynamic. Lucien's hands moved, still clumsy but earnest. Will you help me learn? Alvin's face lit up like dawn breaking. His hands flew in response. You want me to teach you? Who better than my son? The reversal was awkward at first. A child correcting a king, small hands adjusting larger ones, teaching patience to someone who'd commanded armies. But gradually, something beautiful emerged. Alvin would demonstrate a sign, and Lucien would copy it, and when he got it wrong, the boy would giggle silently and show him again. They practiced during meals, in the gardens, in the quiet hours before bed. Lucien's signs grew more natural, less like reciting vocabulary and more like actual speech. And with each lesson, the wall between them crumbled a little more. 3 weeks in, they sat in Alvin's room surrounded by the boy's drawings. Lucien had been practicing a new set of signs, and now his hands moved with careful deliberation. I want to tell you about your mother. Alvin's eyes went wide. His hands hesitated, then signed, You never talk about her. I should have. I was afraid. But you deserve to know. Lucien's signs were slow, thoughtful. Evangeline loved gardens. She'd spend hours planting flowers, getting dirt under her fingernails. She said growing things made her feel connected to something eternal. He continued, and Alvin hung on every word, every sign. Stories about how his parents met, how Evangeline had chosen immortality to stay with Lucien, how she laughed at formal court dinners and scandalized nobles with her humanity. "She used to sing to you," Lucien signed, his movements tender now. "Every night. Lullabies from her childhood. She had a terrible voice, but she didn't care. She said you deserved to hear love, not perfection." Alvin's hands trembled as he signed back. "I don't remember her voice. I'll tell you everything I remember. Every day. I promise." But then Alvin's signs changed, became smaller, heavier. "Father, I need to tell you something." Lucien waited, and the words his son had been carrying for 5 years finally emerged. "I'm sorry she died because of me. I know you wish," his hands faltered. "I know you wish it was me instead." The air left Lucien's lungs. He dropped to his knees so suddenly it should have hurt, bringing himself to Alvin's eye level, his hands gripping his son's shoulders. "No." He signed it first, then said it aloud, fierce and broken. "Never. Never think that." His hands moved, and 5 years of grief and guilt and love poured through them. "You are not the reason she died. You are the reason she lived the way she did, with joy, with purpose, with more love than one person should be able to hold. You are not loss. You are love. The best part of her. The best part of me." Alvin's face crumpled. His mouth opened, and sounds emerged rough, hesitant, but real. "I love you, Papa." 3 words, barely audible, like something precious and fragile being lifted into light. Lucien's carefully maintained composure shattered. He pulled Alvin into his arms, holding him the way he should have been holding him for 5 years. His shoulders shook with sobs he'd been too proud, too afraid to release. "I love you," he whispered into his son's hair. "I love you. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." They stayed like that, father and son, crying together in a room filled with drawings of a woman who'd loved them both. For the first time since Evangeline's death, Lucien felt something shift in his chest, not the feeling of emptiness, but the recognition that love hadn't died with her. It had been waiting, patient and persistent, for him to remember how to reach for it. When they finally pulled apart, Alvin signed with a watery smile, "We're going to be okay, aren't we?" Lucien signed back, his movements fluid now, natural. "Better than okay. We're going to be whole." Outside the window, storm clouds gathered. In his chambers, Lord Draven reviewed his final plans, his amber eyes cold with calculation. The king and prince were bonding, yes, but bonds could be broken. The blood moon ceremony was 3 weeks away. And accidents, as everyone knew, could happen anytime. In his desk drawer, Draven kept a vial of poison stronger than hemlock, fast-acting and untraceable. He'd been saving it for the right moment. He pulled it out now, holding it up to the candlelight, watching the liquid swirl like captured shadows. Soon, he thought. Very soon. But in Alvin's room, a father and son practiced signing stories to each other, building a language of love that no poison could touch, and for now, for this precious, perfect now, they were learning what it meant to be a family again. The blood moon rose like a wound in the sky, casting crimson light through the palace's stained glass windows. Lillian stood in the shadows of the great hall, her heart hammering against her ribs as she watched the vampire court assemble in their finest regalia. They came in silks and velvets the color of blood and midnight, jewels glittering at their throats, their pale faces beautiful and terrible beneath the ceremonial chandeliers. The hall itself seemed designed for judgment, vaulted ceilings that swallowed sound, walls lined with the portraits of dead kings, and at its center, the raised dais where the heir would be presented. Where Alvin would either be accepted or challenged. Where 5 years of isolation would finally come to an end, one way or another. Prince Alvin stood beside his father at the base of the dais, small and impossibly brave in his formal burgundy suit. His hands were steady at his sides, but Lillian could see the tension in his shoulders, the way he kept his chin lifted as if daring the court to find him lacking. Lucien stood like a storm barely contained, his platinum hair pulled back, his dark robes moving around him like living shadows. His hand rested on Alvin's shoulder, a gesture of protection and claim that made several nobles exchange weighted glances. Lord Draven stood with his faction near the eastern wall, his amber eyes cold and calculating. Beside him, other nobles who'd invested in the prince's failure whispered behind gloved hands. They'd spent 5 years building their power on the assumption that Alvin would never inherit. Tonight would prove them right or destroy them completely. The palace bells tolled midnight. The ceremony began. The master of ceremonies, an ancient vampire whose voice carried the weight of centuries, stepped forward. Let the court bear witness. On this blood moon, Prince Alvin Valtoris of the House of Thorns presents himself as heir to the throne. Let those who would support him speak. Let those who would challenge him step forward. The silence stretched like a blade between ribs. Then King Lucien's voice cut through the tension, quiet but absolute. My son will speak for himself. Gasps rippled through the assembly. Draven's expression curdled into something ugly. Speak? The mute prince? This was unprecedented, impossible. Alvin stepped forward, climbing the 3 steps to the dais with measured grace. His hands lifted, and Lillian moved to the edge of the platform where everyone could see her, her role as translator sanctioned by the king himself. The prince's hands began to move, fluid and precise, and Lillian's voice gave them sound. I stand before you not as the heir you expected, but as the heir you need. I have spent 5 years in silence, learning to see what others overlook, to hear what isn't spoken, to understand that strength comes in many forms. His signs grew more passionate, his face alight with conviction. My mother taught me that love is a language that transcends words. My father has shown me that courage means facing your failures and choosing to do better. And my governess, his hands faltered with emotion, then continued, has reminded me that being different doesn't mean being less. Lillian's voice remained steady even as tears pricked her eyes. I may never speak as you do, but I can lead with wisdom, with compassion, with a commitment to seeing every soul in this kingdom, not just the ones who shout the loudest. If you will have me as your future king, I swear by the blood moon and the memory of my mother, I will serve with every part of myself, in whatever language that service requires. The hall fell into stunned silence. Several nobles looked moved, their skepticism wavering. Others, Draven's faction, looked furious at being outmaneuvered. Then Victor stepped forward from his position near the throne, his handsome face solemn. I renounce any claim to succession. My nephew has more courage in his silence than I've shown in a lifetime of words. The throne is his. The court erupted in whispers. Draven's face went white with rage. And then the world exploded into chaos. The great chandelier above the dais, 3 tons of crystal and iron, centuries old, gave a grinding shriek. The chains holding it snapped with sounds like breaking bones. Time fractured into horrible slow motion as the massive structure plummeted downward, directly toward where Alvin stood. Lillian didn't think. Her body moved on pure instinct, throwing herself across the platform. She grabbed Alvin and twisted, putting herself between the boy and the falling death above them. The impact was a meteor strike. Crystal shattered across her back, a shard the size of a dagger piercing her shoulder. The weight drove her to her knees, pain white-hot and absolute. She felt ribs crack, felt blood bloom hot against her skin. But beneath her, clutched against her chest, Alvin was safe. The hall descended into screaming chaos. Nobles scattered. Guards surged forward. And then a sound cut through everything, a sound that stopped King Lucien Valtoris's heart mid-beat. Father. Alvin's voice raw, desperate, loud enough to echo off the vaulted ceiling. A child's scream of pure terror, breaking through 5 years of silence like a dam finally shattering. Lucien moved with vampire speed, crossing the hall in a blur. He fell to his knees beside them, his hands shaking as he took in the scene. Lillian collapsed with crystal embedded in her back, blood pooling beneath her, and Alvin trying to hold her up with hands too small for the weight. "Don't let her die," Alvin sobbed, the words tumbling out rough and desperate, years of silence breaking apart. "Please, Papa, please don't let her die too. Not her. Not again." "I can't, please." Lucien's world narrowed to two people, his son's tear-streaked face and the woman who'd given everything to save him. He gathered them both carefully, Lillian cradled against his chest, while keeping one arm around Alvin. "She won't," he said, and his voice carried through the chaos with absolute authority. "I swear it. On my crown, on my life, she won't." He looked down at his son, and his voice cracked. "And you, my son, will never doubt your worth again. Never. Do you hear me?" Guards were already moving through the crowd. Someone shouted near the eastern wall, "Lord Draven," trying to slip away through a side door. Victor appeared from nowhere, his casual demeanor replaced by cold fury as he grabbed the Chancellor by his robes. "Seize him," Victor called out, his voice ringing with disgust. The chains were cut. "I saw the marks myself." He dragged Draven forward, the Chancellor struggling in his grip. What kind of monster tries to murder a child during his own ceremony? Draven's amber eyes blazed with hatred, any pretense of civility stripped away. "That boy is not fit to rule. He's weak, he's broken. He's brave enough to stand when men like you tried to tear him down." Victor's grip tightened. "You're pathetic. Truly pathetic." Guards surrounded Draven, iron chains wrapping around his wrists. His faction melted into the crowd, their faces pale with fear and the knowledge that their conspiracy had just collapsed spectacularly. The palace physician was already at Lucien's side, his ancient hands moving with practiced efficiency. "We need to move her. Now, Your Majesty." "The crystal." "Save her," Lucien commanded, his eyes flashing crimson. "I don't care what it costs. Save her." They lifted Lillian as carefully as possible, her blood leaving a trail across the marble floor. Alvin clung to his father's hand, still speaking through tears, the words coming easier now as if a dam had broken. "Is she going to be okay? Papa, tell me she's going to be okay." "She will be," Lucien promised, and he meant it with every fiber of his being. "She saved you. Now I'll save her." That's what family does. The word hung in the air between them, family. Not duty, not obligation, but the simple, profound truth they'd all been dancing around for weeks. As they carried Lillian toward the infirmary, the blood moon watched through the windows, bearing witness to the moment when a king, a prince, and a governess became something more. When silence became speech, when fear became courage, and when the promise of tomorrow finally felt like something worth believing in. The infirmary smelled of herbs and clean linen when Lillian finally clawed her way back to consciousness. Pain radiated from her shoulder in steady waves, but it was bearable, the kind of pain that meant survival, not dying. Her eyes fluttered open to find weak sunlight streaming through tall windows, and in the chair beside her bed, Prince Alvin slept curled like a comma, his dark hair falling across his face. He looked younger in sleep, vulnerable in a way he never allowed when awake. His hand was stretched across the bed, fingers barely touching hers, as if even unconscious, he needed to know she was still there. The door opened with barely a whisper of sound. King Lucien entered, and Lillian's breath caught at the transformation. Gone was the rigid, terrifying monarch who'd first interviewed her in the throne room. This man moved differently, still powerful, still commanding, but softer somehow. His platinum hair was loose around his shoulders, his formal robes replaced by simple dark clothing, and his eyes held something she'd never seen before, peace, tentative and fragile, but real. He stopped when he saw she was awake. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Lucien crossed to the other side of her bed, settling into a chair with careful grace, as if afraid sudden movements might shatter something precious. 3 days, he said quietly. You've been unconscious for 3 days. Alvin hasn't left your side except when we physically carried him away to eat. His eyes moved to his sleeping son, and something in his expression cracked open. He kept signing to you, telling you stories, asking you to wake up, promising he'd practice his words if you'd just open your eyes. Lillian's throat tightened. She tried to speak, but Lucien raised a hand gently. Let me say this while I can. His voice was rough, weighted with things he'd kept locked away too long. You gave me back my son. You gave me back myself. 5 years I spent buried alive in my own grief, and he stopped, collecting himself. You walked into this palace and refused to let us stay broken. You saw us when we couldn't see each other. I just helped you remember who you were, Lillian managed, her voice barely above a whisper. You did more than that. Lucien's hand moved to cover hers on the bed, the one Alvin wasn't holding, his touch cold, but gentle. You gave my son language. You gave me courage. You saved his life and nearly lost your own doing it. His eyes met hers, silver gray and devastating in their honesty. I am in your debt for the rest of my immortal life. Whatever you need, whatever you want. I just want him to be happy, Lillian interrupted. Both of you. That's all I've ever wanted. Something passed across Lucien's face, gratitude and grief and hope tangled together. He nodded once, then reached into his pocket and withdrew an official-looking document sealed with the royal crest. Then help me build a kingdom where happiness is possible for everyone. He set the decree on her bedside table. Kingdom-wide sign language education, mandatory in all schools. Special institutions for deaf and mute children, funded by the Crown, staffed by teachers who actually understand that different doesn't mean less. His voice grew stronger. We're calling them Evangeline's houses. After my wife, who believed that every voice deserved to be heard, no matter how it spoke. Tears blurred Lillian's vision. She squeezed his hand, unable to form words, and he squeezed back, a vampire king holding hands with a human governess while his son slept between them, the three of them connected by something deeper than blood. 6 months later, the kingdom had transformed. Lillian stood on the grand balcony overlooking the capital square, her shoulder healed but marked with a scar she wore like a badge of honor. Below, thousands of citizens packed the streets, their faces upturned toward the palace. Humans and vampires mixed together, nobles and commoners, old and young, all of them waiting. Beside her, Prince Alvin stood in his formal burgundy suit, but he'd insisted on keeping the top button undone. His father stood behind him, one hand resting on his shoulder in a gesture that had become their signature, protector and protected, father and son, together. Alvin's hands lifted, and the crowd fell silent. Lillian stood beside him, not to translate, he didn't need that anymore, but to support, to be present, to be family. My people, Alvin signed, and his voice emerged too, soft but clear, speaking the words he chose to speak while his hands gave shape to the rest. For 5 years, I lived in silence. Not because I had nothing to say, but because I didn't know how to say it in ways the world would hear. His signs grew more animated, passionate, and across the square, thousands of hands moved with him, imperfect, unpracticed, but trying. The kingdom had been learning. My mother taught me that love speaks every language. My father showed me that courage means letting yourself be vulnerable. And Lillian, he glanced at her with a smile that could light the world, reminded me that being different makes you powerful, not powerless. He paused, his hands moving in the sign that meant strength and silence together, a combination he'd invented himself. Silence isn't empty. It's full of words the world needs to learn. It's full of wisdom that speaks without sound. It's full of love that doesn't need volume to be heard. The crowd erupted, not in cheers, though those came too, but in signs. Thousands of hands waving, moving, speaking in the language Alvin had made his own. Children signed to parents. Nobles signed to servants. The whole kingdom responding in a language that said, "We see you, we hear you, you matter." Lucien's hand tightened on his son's shoulder, and when Lillian looked up, she saw tears tracking down the vampire king's face. He signed with his free hand, clumsy still but sincere, proud. So proud. That evening, after the ceremony ended and the crowds dispersed, the three of them stood alone on a smaller balcony overlooking the palace gardens. The moon hung full and silver above them, and below, the city glittered with lights, each one representing someone learning a new way to speak, a new way to listen. Alvin leaned against the railing between them, his small frame dwarfed by the two adults who'd become his anchors. His hands moved slowly, almost shy. "Are we going to be okay?" Lucian knelt so they were eye level, his signs fluid now after months of practice. "More than okay. We're together." "That's all that matters," Lillian added, her own hands moving in sync with her words. Alvin reached into his pocket and pulled out a small carved bird, wings spread wide, every feather detailed with painstaking care. He placed it in Lillian's palm, his fingers lingering over hers. "This is for the day I wasn't alone anymore," he signed. Then, speaking aloud because he chose to, "Thank you for teaching me I was never broken. Just waiting for someone to learn my language." Lillian pulled him into a hug, and Lucian wrapped his arms around them both, the three of them silhouetted against the moon. They stood like that while the kingdom below learned to speak with their hands, while silence found its voice, while a family that had been shattered learned what it meant to be whole. In Alvin's room, 1,843 carved animals sat in their trunk, a monument to loneliness. But on his desk sat something new, three figures carved together, hands touching, faces turned toward each other. Father, governess, and son. Not perfect, but complete. And in the garden below, Evangeline's flowers bloomed in the moonlight, as if she too was watching, as if she too was smiling, as if she'd known all along that love would find its way back, not through words, but through the courage to learn a language the heart already knew.